So I would be inclined to say good afternoon, everybody, but I think we've got people from several places of the world. So for some people, it might be morning. I know certainly for some people that I recognize, Bhuvan, that you're somewhere in the evening because you're from India. So that's the only thing I really started liking, not liking, wrong word, but still one little positive thing of the whole COVID thing that is coming over us is the fact that I've been in tons of meetups and online sessions and been meeting people from around the world. And I'm going to assume, James, you've been through the same experience. And I can't even start imagining how I would have been doing that by physically traveling. I would have been dead by now, probably. So that's one of the good things. Yeah. So today I'd like to talk about about a year ago. So December 2019, I was completely in the process of finalizing a book. The book is called 97 Things Every Scrum Practitioner Should Know. It consumed most of my time of the fall of 2019 because looking back, 97 is really a high number. A lot more than I anticipated, but that's okay. Sometimes you want to do stuff and not know what you're going to run into, and then only find out afterwards. Oh my God, why did I do that? No, I had fun. One of the lovely things I got to meet and sort of work distantly or remotely with new people, and James, that does include you because we've never met. We had never worked together.
No.
I didn't even have your email address. So what happened about a year ago? There's this Belgian lady that you know, Martine de Vos. So Martine de Vos, how would you say that in English? She's from Belgium. She's been involved in the world of Scrum. Even the years before the Agile Manifesto, she co-wrote a paper with Mike Beagle, a couple of other people about the extension pattern language thing for Scrum. That was in the 90s. So, and I'm from Belgium. And I was in touch with Martine a couple of times, so I went back to Martine. I think you know James Coplien. Would you be able to share his email address with me? And so she did. She did the same, by the way, with Linda Rising, because in the book I also wanted to show respect to, like, can I say that, early pioneers like James and Linda and Martine and so on. I wanted the book to also reflect, have stuff from those people. Now, Martine decided not to write anything about Scrum because she's sort of disappointed with a couple of evolutions, let's say. But she did give me the email address of James. So a little bit scared, James, I sent you an email. And much to, first of all, my relief, starting to relax then. And it was also a little bit, not to my surprise, but in a way, yes. You started responding enthusiastically, sending in stuff. Quickly and very openly. No things, no whatever, no contracts, no NDA types of thing that you came up with. So that was all cool, huge. So I'm now working with, sorry to say that, the famous James Coplien. That was really cool. So we went back and forth on your writings with edits and suggestions and so on, and I really enjoyed it. So in the end, I think James, you're the champion contributor because you've got 5 articles in the book. So 5 out of 97 are by James Coplien, which is really cool. And the
I have
idea
a lot
today.
of monkeys in the basement.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Send a couple of them. Can I hire them to get some stuff done for me because it takes me so much time. All these things. So what I would like to do today, so everybody, thank you very much for joining. What I would like to do is the following. So James contributed 5 articles. We probably can't read them all, but I would like to read them for you so that you have some insight into the book. And then I hope James can share a little bit of why he thought that topic was important to contribute to the book. We'll see what comes out of that. And then hopefully maybe some questions, either via the chat or if somebody, I'll keep an eye on that, somebody wants to raise a hand, ask a question about the things. And then we've got about smallish 1 hour and a half. So I'll give it time to go to at least 2 and hopefully maybe even 3 articles. One of the things I liked in your articles, James, because I'm sensitive to that, is an article, whether that's an article in a book, a paper, a blog note, or whatever, even a book. I like slightly provocative titles. It draws people attention. And the ambition is to create a not just slightly provocative title, but also title that stands for something. And that's why I wanted to start with one of your articles, James. And it's called Why There Are No User Stories at the Top of Your Product Backlog. So first of all, little provocative title, and I like it. So let me read the article. Then let's see what James you have to say over that, and let's then see what people want to ask about. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Welcome everybody. By the way, the thing is being recorded. I should have told you that upfront, so that if you really want to switch off your video, that would be fine. I think both James and I would agree, would understand that you don't want to be connected to any of us. You want to be in the session, but not visibly afterward. So let's start with why there are no user stories at the top of your product backlog. Words mean things. The word user story suggests something that is a story and in the user space. The term has come to mean a formatted sentence of the form as an X, I want Y because of Z. Some agile folks take that literally and dutifully write stuff in that format. But more insightfully, Ron Jeffries once correctly pointed out that this shorthand is just an invitation for a future conversation between an end user and a developer. We can breathe a sigh of relief at having restored the possibility of storytelling. Stories are priceless in understanding end user needs. The sprint goal should probably be a potential title or moral of the key user story. But user stories are, so to speak, just the beginning of the story. Perhaps they should be called user riddles. The job of design is to solve the riddle and to deliver an implementation commensurate with the answer. Scrum follows the lean practice of eliminating murring, that is overburden, and instead smoothing out flow. Though a user may come to us with a need, we don't just transform that need into a solution overnight or at some meeting called sprint planning. Business solution design takes time, dialogue, exploration, and feedback. A solution eventually emerges and works its way to the top of the product backlog as an enabling specification. The product owner owns specifications. That is, it is the product owner's responsibility that they be there. They are not specifications of the problem, but of solutions. The product owner doesn't maintain a requirements backlog, but rather a product backlog. The products serve the product owner's vision of the product increments that will generate value, not just of the problem that provides a market opportunity. A single solution might support several user stories, but the opposite isn't true. A good product backlog documents the agreements between stakeholders about what will be delivered, particularly in the near term. The product owner may socialize user stories with stakeholders to create product backlog items and may tag them with user stories. But a proper product backlog item is not a story. It's something the team built. If a product has a long backlog, let's say 6 or 7 sprints, then some bottom items may be user stories. It's too early to nail down a specific implementation yet. As they come to the top, they become enabling specifications. Good Scrum practice recommends reducing murring by striving to make the top 3 sprints of the backlog into enabling specifications. And a great Agile Scrum team usually does not have a long backlog, but instead looks 3 or 4 sprints ahead. Anything else is guessing. If a product can look 6 months ahead with certainty, Waterfall probably suits them better than Scrum. So if your product backlog is 7 sprints long, or if it is a list of user stories, you have some Kaizen to do to look beyond a casual understanding of Scrum to something that really rocks. So no user stories at the top of your product backlog. I think that deserves some explaining, James. Why is that important besides the text I just read? How do you see that?
Thanks for the reading. Good reading. I guess I'd turn the question around and ask, why would you put user stories on the product backlog if you understand Scrum? Scrum is a framework for a product owner realizing her vision or his vision through the team, and the requirements are already there in the product owner's mind, and the product owner says, okay, I'm going to add value by solving this. And then the product owner comes up with a product goal, to use the new Scrum Guide terminology, and then splits that product goal down into sprint goals. And each sprint will achieve some sprint goal, otherwise it's a failed sprint. And then we achieve the sprint goal, which are usually in the end user space or the market space or the business space. We achieve that goal by building stuff and delivering stuff. And so what the product backlog is a list of the stuff we're going to deliver. Now, if it were just a list of what we need the end user to realize, that is a list of what are called outcomes, then the product owner is just giving requirements to the developers, and the process of design, that is, of solving a problem, of changing what we need to do and how we need to do it. The job of design is done by the development team. Well, then the product owner doesn't own the product. The developers own the product. And now we lose conceptual integrity of the product. So, I mean, if you look at great products, I mean, you can bet. If we look at the iPhone, who was the product owner for the iPhone? Well, probably Steve Jobs. Now, he wasn't a product manager who was down there, telling the team members what to do or organizing the work. But Steve Jobs had the vision. Henry Ford was the product owner of the Model T. Linus Torvald is the product owner of Linux, and so on and so forth. And so they're the person with the vision who ties this together, and we need that conceptual integrity. Now, of course, the developers have great ideas, and the developers are going to contribute product backlog items, and the whole thing is a team effort. I'm not saying by any means that the product owner is going to throw the product backlog over the wall. Building the product backlog is a collaborative effort, but the product owner has the final say. Now, if you believe all of that, and that's pretty core to Scrum, and you can find all of that in both the old Scrum Guide and the new Scrum Guide, then there are no user stories on the product backlog, because a user story, to quote Ron Jeffries, is just a promise for a future conversation between an end user and a developer. That's all it is. It's to help people understand what the need is to be met. And in Scrum, I mean, this comes down to the sprint goal. The sprint goal and the product goal are how we convey that kind of information to the team, or how we document that agreement that the development team and the product owner and the stakeholders all come to. So a lot of people have product owners who are unable to do design, or they're old product managers who don't define the product. All they do is they manage people and they manage lists and things like this, and they turn them into product owners. I mean, I've actually heard a certified Scrum trainer say, and he said this on LinkedIn in writing, that all a product owner is in Scrum is a product manager who has learned Scrum. And I mean, nothing can be further from the truth. The product owner has a vision, owns the product, and is leading the team into creating value. A product manager doesn't do that. So Steve Jobs was not the product manager of the iPhone. Maybe they had a product manager who was overseeing the coordination of the parts, but he was the product owner. And so he would have talked to end users or to constituencies about the user stories. And then there's this transformation. And the key insight here that blows people away, I ask people, who does design in Scrum? Who does high-level design? Who changes requirements, whatever that means, into a product? And the answer is the product owner. The developers implement the design, or they do low-level design. And of course, the lines here are not hard and fast. But your product owner, if they're accountable for value, is accountable for the content of the product. And I think the Scrum Guide still says that the product owner is solely responsible for the content of the product backlog. I mean, everyone contributes, but the responsibility falls on the product owner. And it's a product backlog, not a requirements backlog.
Yeah. So there's a couple of beautiful messages in that. Yeah. There's a couple of beautiful messages. Yeah. Go ahead.
I just run into so few people who understand this. And so this is why we did the organizational patterns and the Scrum patterns. It's just, I have an exam. I wish we would have given everyone who's attending here the exam. Maybe we still can. It's a little 8-question exam. And I mean, certified people get 4 out of 8 questions right. And these are simple questions like, what's the purpose of the daily Scrum? And how is the product backlog ordered? And I mean, really, really basic stuff. And like 90% of Scrum Masters have less than a 50% understanding of the core basic stuff. Now, this is something very powerful about the idiocy and irrelevance of certification and of the value of the certification exams. But also says something about our ability, our inability as a community to make that paradigm shift to thinking in a Scrum way. We just don't want to let go of this project manager way. And viewing the product backlog as a list of user stories is a project manager thing. It's a list of requirements. The project manager gives the requirements to the team and they deal with them.
So product backlog
is your reaction to my reaction?
Yeah, cool. I like it. That's why I wanted to read it, because beyond the provocative title, there's a beautiful message. One of the things that it reminds me of, and maybe that's good to share with people, I remember back in 2011, which is almost 10 years ago, I was attending one of the beta versions of the PSPO, so the product owner class that Ken Schwaber had been building. And back then, that's almost 10 years ago, sort of let's say the ultimate frustration that led Ken to build that class together with Alex Armstrong was the question, and it was sort of the opening question of the class, and maybe that's something you'll recognize. In Scrum, who writes the user stories? Because that was irritating and frustrating us tremendously by then, because first of all, Scrum doesn't say that you have to write user stories, point one. User stories are being abused as sort of the new form of sort of old school IT requirements. Product backlog is not just the new name for the old school requirements list. And secondly, and so you hinted at that also, James, a lot of is collaboration actually from specific accountabilities and viewpoints. And one of the frustrating things was that people saw, a lot of organizations saw the product owner role, oh yeah, that's just a new name for the old school requirements gatherer or requirements engineer, now capturing requirements and not as 60 pages use cases, but as user stories, but still throwing them over the wall to the people doing the work. So that was all in there, and that's what you just highlighted. Also, the idea of emergence and emergent design, not looking 6-7 sprints ahead in time with fully detailed whatever requirement types of things. So emergence and collaboration, and that is so important, and that's also what you call the Scrum way, right?
There's something else that you reminded me of. So forget Scrum for a second and just talk about user stories. So you just use the phrase, quote, write user stories, unquote. You don't write user stories. You tell them. So if you go back to the origin of user stories, and I can't, and this isn't Ron Jeffries, but who's the guy who hangs out with Chet, wonderful guy. He was part of C3.
Chet Hendrickson?
I can't remember.
Yeah,
but he said, a user story is something you tell. I mean, you sit down at a bar and have a semi-drunken conversation between, the product owner and a client. And he says a user story is three things. He says it's the 3 C's. It's the conversation, the card, and the code. And the card is optional. It's the conversation and the code. If you think it's the card, you're clueless. And now we've taken the card, and it's not only a card, but we put it in Jira, and we put it on the backlog, and we give it business stature. And it means, wow, how clueless can you get? I mean, ignorance abounds. And Scrum trainers are celebrating this. No, Scrum is not an oral tradition. This is all in the Scrum guide. The things that people are using user stories for in Scrum are against the Scrum guide. So if you want to be a Scrum lawyer and say, explore the question whether it's an oral tradition, no, it's there. And Gunther, you can probably say a lot more about this because you just gotten done writing this article about the
history of Scrum. Just trying to look across all of the updates and the changes, not just the Scrum guide, but throughout the history of Scrum. And it's fascinating, by the way, James, all respect for the work that you've been doing, even sort of before Scrum. I think you've been acknowledged a little bit for that, but with the patterns thing, and then, and a lot of what you say is already in all those things. So back in the 90s, even before, even in the paper that Mike Beadle, Martin de Vos and so on wrote, the Scrum patterns, which is presented as an extension to your organizational patterns of that time, James, they also describe those things already. So that's quite beautiful.
Yeah, if you look at the organizational patterns, which were published in 1995, and Mike was a part of that, like 90% of Scrum is there. And then you're right, Mike and 4 other people came around and wrote that extension pattern language saying, well, there's a few things missing that we want to add to this to get to the full of Scrum. But I mean, we know that the daily Scrum came from that work. If you look at Jeff's most recent book, there's a lot more than the daily Scrum that came from those patterns. So, I mean, most of Scrum was there in written form in 1995. In the organizational patterns, and was already in broad use.
Yeah, you also have an article about the daily Scrum in this. It's something I'm not going to read, but again, always going back to the origins of the daily Scrum, which is what you observed working at Poland, right? That Quattro Pro described. And in that, I'm totally in that history thing right now. So that Scrum Patterns paper of 1999, they called it Scrum meetings, capitalized Scrum meetings. And that was later converted into the daily Scrum. They call it daily meetings. It was 15 minutes already, same time, same place. That has been completely stable based upon your observations of what works really well at Borland, right? So that's also the idea.
Except, no, the 15 minutes came from Jeff, because at Borland, these things were 2 hours. And they were not stand-up meetings. And there's a wonderful, another chapter in your book. From the guy who was actually running the Quattro Pro project. And he said, well, we call them standing meetings, which in English means a meeting which regularly recurs on the calendar. And he feels that people call them stand-up meetings because they misunderstood the term standing meeting. But he says, no, we didn't stand up.
Yeah, and that's also one of the fascinating things of the book. You and I were working together, thinking about the daily Scrum, and it was Bob Warfield, by the way. I don't know if anybody knows him. But again, a sort of paying respect to original pioneers, because he indeed came up with this idea of something that turned into the daily Scrum later on. So that's really, really cool. There was one question about your exam with the questions, James. Was that the Scrum game you were referring to?
No.
Okay.
So I mean, there's this little exam I have. It's it's now a 9-question exam. The 9th question is, do you have a certification? But if anyone is interested in taking the exam, send me an email. I'll be happy to send you the exam. Send me your answers, and I'll tell you your score. This is actually feeding my research. I've run this exam on more than 500 people, and it's really, really telling, because the average score is it's between 4 and 5, but closer to 4 out of 8. And if you look at the comments here, one of my colleagues, who I don't know if he sent this to everyone, but has had an intervention with his company, and he noticed in his company that the score on the exam was inversely proportional to how much training they had. It turns out if you look at scrum.org and Scrum Alliance, and there's a couple of others, maybe I shouldn't say this, but there's one that really stands out of doing spectacularly bad on the exam. Don't worry, it's not scrum.org.
Okay, cool.
It's one of the others, but we probably shouldn't go there.
Yeah, well, let's not do that. Before I go into the next article, I just want to come back on a question by Richard Briantes. Is that the way to pronounce it? I don't know. About capitalized or not capitalized Scrum. And it's funny because so I wrote a little book about Scrum. That was my first book, my pocket guide. And in that book, I wrote that it's Scrum, not capitalized, because it's not an acronym, it's not an abbreviation. And then you always have these smart people coming back. Yeah, but you know what? The first paper of Scrum, they wrote it capitalized. Yeah, indeed, they did. And even the paper of 1999 was Scrum capitalized. Why? I don't know. It was probably because it wasn't thought through too much. Don't look for hidden tricks or traps or whatever in that. It's just, we don't write it capitalized anymore. At least I don't, because it's not an acronym. That's the only reason, Richard. I hope that helps a little bit. So the next article by yourself, James, is also one because I like it again because of the title. The title says it all again. And it's called Specialization is for Insects. Again, provocative title. But it's based upon a book that you quoted also, Robert Heinlein, book by Robert Heinlein. When you're saying in the article, Robert Heinlein has a great quote on the topic of specialization. So let me read the quote. It's from that book. And the quote goes as follows. A human being should be able to change a diaper, plan an invasion, butcher a hawk, con a ship, design a building, write a sonnet, balance accounts, build a wall, set a bone, comfort the dying, take orders, give orders, cooperate, act alone, solve equations, analyze a new problem, pitch manure, program a computer, cook a tasty meal, fight effectively, die gallantly. Specialization is for insects. And then James go on to say, one of our favorite Scrum patterns, and as you know, I don't know whether you can see it, it's over there, the latest book by James and all of his friends of the patterns movement. It's called A Scrum Book, Spirit of the Game. And he's referring to that by saying, one of our favorite Scrum patterns is cross-functional team. But there is much confusion about its meaning. Folks commonly assume it means that everyone should be able to do everything. This is probably ideal for minimizing talent blockages, but folks discount it as unrealistic and too costly from a training perspective. The intent behind cross-functional teams is that they should offer all competencies necessary to complete their work, and in particular, that developers collectively have all skills necessary to efficiently build product. Why does Scrum call us to this kind of work community? First, to handle variance. You can't staff a team with exactly the right number of UX designers, testers, programmers, and database people to match the workload ideally. The demand for each specialization changes both during the sprint and from sprint to sprint. Over-engineer a bit to reduce the risk. Second, we want to make sure the team isn't blocked if one uniquely skilled person is overloaded or on sick leave during a particular sprint. Another team member should be able to pick up the slack. Third, times change. The market calls for one set of expertise today and may call for another one tomorrow. Don't hire team members for what they know today or for how they have applied their knowledge in the past, but rather for their ability to acquire and apply emerging knowledge in the future. In his book Drive, The Amazing Truth About What Motivates Us, Daniel Pink, consumer, a lot of people know that, at least they should. Daniel Pink reminds us that people love to grow in their area of specialization. It's what Daniel Pink calls mastery. So these calls to cross-functionality elicit a visceral negative reaction. The usual claim is that you can't have an expert in every field within the team's endeavors. The more sober perspective is that you don't need world-class excellence, just competence. If necessary, use Kaizen to grow from there. Scrum emphasizes learning as a team. Let's say that again and again, you find you are missing some specialized skill set, or that you need more knowledgeable testing people than you have. Fix it with cross-training, which is cheap and adds value, or hiring, which adds both short and long-term costs and risks, and more rapidly bring your team to a point of diminishing returns on capacity as a function of size. The sooner you fix it, the sooner you'll be improving again. You will suck in the meantime, but that's okay. Good Kaizen bears a bit of reflective regret. And it's great to belong to a team where people can learn as individuals. Pink's admonition about growing in knowledge doesn't imply a limited number of specializations. It is just as rewarding, or more so, to grow in mastery of a new area. Great team members learn, grow, and diversify their skills. Against some sort of fighting old school IT type-ish ideas and interpretation of what cross-functionality means. Specialization is for insects. Anything to add to that, James? Why is that important? I recognize this because it's still a huge misconfusion out there, what cross-functional teams mean.
Yeah, I mean, and it's because of that confusion that I wrote it. And a lot of this isn't so much for the people who value Scrum, but for new trainees or new clients who say, well, I can't have everyone on the team understand how to do everything. And I'm like, well, you don't have to have everyone on the team understand how to do everything. It's just that the team has to be able to, in an autonomous, self-contained way, deliver a product without depending on other teams. And so I wanted to clarify that. And a lot of people try to fix this with words, like they'll say, use words like T-shaped individuals or multi-skilled teams instead of cross-functional teams. And yeah, I mean, they're right. But I wanted to lay this out, very explicitly and very clearly. So there is a lot of confusion about this. But operationally, this is one of the pushbacks I get when I go in and teach people Scrum, particularly in some cultures. So German culture, this is much more of a problem. Japanese culture, this is very, very seriously a problem, because those cultures still have a lot of valuation of certification and of specialization. and of, especially in Japan, for respect for someone's expertise and its licensed, certified, degreed expertise.
I see it also a lot reinforced by sort of bad types of performance reviews that we have in place. Rewards, incentives, objectives that people are given. It's also very individual. It's based on individual specialization and so on. And both Jeff Stewart and Richard Brilliantes are asking about it. So you've got this aspect of culture, what you say, James, Germany, but also what I see in a lot of large organizations, the way that people are being incentivized and so on. It's about extrinsic motivations. It's money. It's driven to, you have to be the expert. It's about status, ego, and so on. You see that also?
Yeah, I see that too, but I think there's something much deeper here. I mean, there's this timeless debate about is humankind a social animal, or are they lone wolves? And we have aspects of both. I mean, so you have the nuclear family of caveman living in a cave, and then eventually, for survival over history, start agricultural communities and growing into communities. But there's kind of this innate fear in people, and again, this comes back to the reward mechanism, that if I'm going to be rewarded or punished, sorry, I want to be able to control what I'm being rewarded or punished for, and therefore this becomes an individual effort, and I'm going to stand on my individual skills and abilities, and I'm going to respect others' skills and abilities because they know what they're doing, as long as they respect mine, and then we'll all get along well together. But then you run into all these load balancing problems, and the fact that these skills are not timeless, and all these other problems that the article mentions. So I do think there is something on the dark side of humanity, which is a very deep natural motivation for people to cling on to something where they can say, I'm the expert, I have this piece of paper that proves I'm the expert, therefore you dare not question me. Because people hate the conflict, and they hate, well, they're uncomfortable being challenged, and they're certainly uncomfortable being proven wrong. So if they have a piece of paper that guarantees they cannot be proven wrong, then this is how they get psychological safety. Oh, I hate that phrase, psychological safety. I mean, it's a political weapon, and people who are angling for that are basically insecure people who can't see beyond their navel into the dynamics of a team, and they're so busy defending their own safety that they can't see the. So instead of trying to prevent something, they should be aspiring to do something at a team level. But we have this phrase called psychological safety that's really become broad in the industry, and basically it's a negative reaction. It's trying to use negative energy to fix things. Instead of trying to remove the bad, we should just aspire to do the good. And aspiring to do the good means the whole team working as one mind. And if you have the whole team working as one mind, then you don't have to deal with this stupid issue of psychological safety.
It also means,
more often
for
gets
me,
used as a weapon.
creating or managing or fostering, whatever you want to call it, an environment that helps people make the right choices and inspires them to do the right thing. So again, we talked about it shortly. It's about good, bad. It's about how can we help people do the right stuff, inspire them, or create an environment for that.
Yeah, and the other thing, I like what you say, creating the environment. That's doing stuff. That's getting the beanbag chairs. That's getting the great tools. That's getting the right processes. Another term I hate is this fluffy term, agile mindset or Scrum mindset. No, you don't go in and deliver a mindset. People do stuff. It's in doing the stuff that you get change, not in sitting and meditating and getting an agile mindset. And this is about really building stuff. We're running a business here. This isn't Zen meditation. So
in that sense, I always
think
like
that
to say that, you know, in Scrum terms, practices and values in a way go hand in hand. It's not like first you can't upload new values or new mindsets to people. You help them acquire new practices, new ways of working, and sort of mindset and beliefs and whatever come along, or maybe not. What I also wanted to point
values.
out. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Go you first. You're on a
No,
roll.
no, you finish this, and then I wanna close this with something I want to bring up. So go ahead.
Okay. There's a model of learning that comes out of a Royal Dutch Shell, which is called single loop, double loop, and triple loop learning. So single loop learning is at the level of process, so old project management kind of stuff. Double loop learning is at the level of changing structure, changing relationships. And triple loop learning is at the level of changing values and principles. You don't come in and install a set of values and principles. Now, values are extremely important because it's the values that drive the structure, and it's the structure that drives the process. This is a very powerful model. Peter Senge has bought into it. A lot of other people have bought into it. But you don't get values by printing them on the back of your business card or by asking people what they are on the Scrum certification exam. The Scrum Alliance has this motto, changing the world of work. Whereas if you look at, the Scrum Alliance values or the Scrum values, it's changing the America of work. These are very American-centric, male-centric, power-centric values. Every organization has a powerful set of its own values that may reflect some things that come from their indigenous culture. And by all means, embrace those, encourage them, support them. But different people have different values. Anthropologists have studied this. If you look at different cultures, there is no universal morality. The only universal sin is incest. Why is it so bad? The reason it's bad, Christian asked this question, is because, again, these values are used as a weapon. So a good example is that when we were working on the book, Cesario Ramos, I trust you know Cesario well, right?
Yeah,
he's a good mutual friend. He and I were sitting having a knockdown, drag-out argument in the front room of the hotel. And Cesario and I have a lot of mutual respect. Wonderful, wonderful guy. And Dina Fries comes along. She's this Danish woman, and she's in shock. She says, guys, stop it. And we both looked at her and said, Dina, go away. Because her cultural value was that disagreement and noise and argumentation was a bad thing and was going to send out negative energy and be destructive. Whereas Cesario and I know that this is the mode that we get into where we're passionate and we can really touch each other's souls. Now, it takes a lot of trust to do that, but it's in that passion and that electricity where the really exciting stuff happens. Whereas if we're in an environment of psychological safety, this sanitary, crazy, it's like wearing moral masks or something like that. It's just terrible. So yes, I believe values are important, but I don't think an organization should put itself in a position to tell you what your values are. And the Scrum Guide does that.
Cool. Yeah, a while ago, it was a little movie I made. It's like 2 years ago, against this phrase of this expectation: a Scrum Master should create a safe environment for the team. And that is totally true. But safe means actually very unsafe, in the sense people speaking up, having arguments, having discussions. So in traditional terms, that is true. But it's in traditional terms very unsafe, because in general people wouldn't do that. What I wanted to share still, James, with your article, let me read the last sentence again. Great team members learn, grow, and diversify their skills. And that resonated with me, because I know the last week I've been totally diving into the history of Scrum, but even before that, I think historical awareness is quite important, hence including people like Linda and Bob Warfield in the book, but also in a way, I regularly find myself going back to that beautiful paper called The New Product Development Game. And I'm reminded regularly that for myself, cross-functionality is in a way only the beginning. And that's what resonated with me in that last sentence, James. The new product development game talks about cross-fertilization. So a cross-functional composition of the team is only the beginning. And I think with all of the agile movement and even with Scrum, we have lost that, the idea of cross-fertilization. So our future should not just be cross-functional composition of things, it should be about cross-fertilization. And that's what you say, learn, grow, and diversify their skills. Learn new skills, learn from each other, do something you haven't done before. It is refreshing, not just for you, but also for the very mature, senior, whatever people. Gives you new insights. So cross-fertilization, that's for me the future of cross-functional. That's sort of beyond that.
Just a quick insight on that. New product development game largely comes from Nonaka Sensei, and he's largely looking at innovation. So how do you get innovation into organizations? And he claims that a lot of innovation comes from organizational learning. So he's really big on organizational learning, and he has this thing called the Seiki model. But it's primarily about innovation, and a lot of that has gotten lost in Scrum. I mean, you'll hear the word once in a while, but the actual mechanics of it and making it work. There's a wonderful, wonderful book called Where New Ideas Come From by Johnson. And he has done some studies about where innovation comes from, looking through history. And one of the 10 or so things he says is that great ideas come from cities. And again, we're back to this, is humankind a social animal or an individual? But he says innovation comes from the cross-fertilization from the diversity you get in large urban centers. And I mean, he can document this. He says, if you look at the emergence of major advances in society, I mean, not fire, but, maybe harness natural power or advances in architecture or whatever, they come out of the cities where you have people from different backgrounds cross-fertilizing each other. So by the way, when I teach my Scrum class, we do the velocity game. I don't know how many of you have done the velocity game. It's a Scrum simulation. And at the beginning of the class, I have people count off and we form the teams. And what I did initially is made sure that one of the teams was diverse. So in a class of about 20 people, I typically get, 3 women. Well, I'd make sure they were all on the same team. So that team was a diverse team, 2 or 3 women and 2 or 3 men. And you know what? In the velocity game, that team would always beat the pants off of all the other teams. It was amazing. So this is real. And so when you're hiring people,
diversity actually works.
It really works. When you're hiring people, don't look at their CV. Look at the Y chromosome. It matters. And people are too often, it gets back to this question of expertise again. I want the person who is the expert on Kubernetes or something like that. No, that's a flash in the pan. You want people who can think, who can innovate, who can learn. You want people who can learn, who are hungry to learn. And this goes all the way back to Nonaka Sensei's foundations behind Scrum that inspired Jeff.
Yeah. And that has gotten lost a little bit, I'm afraid. That cross-functionality is, for me, only the beginning. It's sort of, and imagine, that's also why you wrote the article. Imagine it's only the beginning, and it seems already so difficult to achieve for a lot of companies and get the meaning behind it. So we've got some work to do. That's also one thing that I remember, James, when inviting you to contribute to the book, that you honestly shared that it's going to be very difficult to write something new about Scrum. But if you can repeat some messages again, that will be fine too, because that's worthwhile too. Well, I still do hope we got some at least some new ideas or new perspectives on Scrum in the book somewhere. Who knows? I want to take one more article by yourself, James, and it's called Thinking Big. And again, the title is not maybe that provocative yet, although if you read it with enough sort of cynicism, you might sense it. Thinking big. So, James, you started the article with a quote that is from the Scrum at Scale guide. So there seems to be a Scrum at Scale guide. I did explicitly ask you, do you really want to use or refer to that specific framework? And you insisted on doing that. And that's where my role as an editor then stops. I want to, yeah, okay. And you're like, I can take it. Nobody's Gunther. Okay. So it starts with a quote from the Scrum at Scale guide. Scrum, as originally outlined in the Scrum Guide, is a framework for developing, delivering, and sustaining complex products by a single team. That's from the Scrum at Scale Guide. So that's what the Scrum at Scale Guide says. And then you say, James, these days, scaling frameworks promise to make the elephant dance as big organizations seek a slice of the agile pie. They work in the sense that military hierarchy works, yet hierarchy is hardly conducive to agile's individuals and interactions, referring to the first statement, right? In a Scrum at Scale team of teams hierarchy, where each node has 5 subordinate nodes, and a node is or what we call other teams of or individual developers, an organization of, I don't know if anybody has a calculator with you, but not least, an organization of 625 people features an average of 7.5 hops between developers. Small world theory, it's a theory that James refers to, have a look at Wikipedia. Small world theory proposes that everyone on Earth is connected by at most 6 connection hubs. 6. Scrum at Scale establishes connectivity between 625 people that is not as good as society provides for 8 billion people. Did I already say that James likes to be a little bit provocative sometimes? His beautiful statement. But few Scrum developments need to be this big. Excuses for scaling include the assumption that a small group has small intellectual capacity and cannot handle the scope of a complex product. Yet the human mind is boundless. Another excuse is productivity. With Scrum talking heads speaking of increasing velocity by orders of magnitude through Kaizen. That's where my editorial work worked a little bit, but not naming people, but saying Scrum talking heads. So, okay. So if it's between a better process and a larger organization, the choice should be clear. The Borland QPWs, Skypes, and other gems of history testify to the ability of small teams to build large things. Nevertheless, business is more than just 5 developers, a product owner, and a Scrum Master. You need distribution channels, sales, and marketing. Good product owners have a team that may include a model shop, analysts, and many others. Personnel takes care of payroll and pensions. Support holds customers' hands. We too often pretend we can divorce these from development. But that's a myth from the build it and they will come days. Many of these folks need a good connection to development. These days it goes by the name of Enterprise Scrum, and hierarchy does not cut it. How does small world theory handle it? With hubs. With the advent of the internet, we found that web pages exhibit a pattern of connection where every few nodes with a very high degree of connection tie everything together. Such networks are called scale-free networks. Again, there's a look it up on Wikipedia, there's a reference to that. So scale-free networks. In Carl Castillo's figure from Wikipedia, we see the hubs highlighted. And it's a silly idea, I know, but I'm still going to show it in front of my camera. That's sort of the picture. So you see hubs highlighted. Yeah. Look it up on Wikipedia. So each network has multiple tops. So it can be for an organizational structure. Running an agile enterprise is a matter of introducing such hubs and nurturing latent hubs, rather than routing communication through the least common manager. Scaled Scrum approaches recognize a few hub structures, such as the Scrum of Scrums, but far too few in number to be scale-free. What are good hubs? Guilds, system testing, architecture, code stewards, the water cooler. Management is particularly important. Weakening the management connection with empowerment programs, leaves teams uncoordinated. To be agile means stepping back from the extreme fads of the moment and honoring what history has shown to work well. So again, thank you, James, for this contribution. I hope it makes people think, but it connects a lot to that. I think I see it less as a hype these days, certainly in the parts where I work, but I think everybody recognizes scale to be sort of a hype. And some really smart business people really reach out of that hype and capitalizing on it.
Yeah, and the hype, of course, is based in fear and ignorance, as well as in history. Here's another history. I mean, how have large organizations always been run? Well, we go back to Bismarck and the Bismarck military hierarchy. I mean, my family came out of Germany in the mid-19th century. And in the mid-19th century, everybody in German society was part of Bismarck's German military hierarchy. So my ancestors were farmers, and they were called Fußleute. So, I mean, they were the farmers who fought with pitchforks, right? I mean, they didn't have guns, they didn't have horses, so they're Fußleute, foot soldiers, right? But everyone was in the military hierarchy. That works well for a slow-moving, simple system. One of the great things I learned when I was at Bell Laboratories, I mean, two guys taught me everything I know, and their names are Dennis de Boer and Tom Burrows. And we dealt a lot with complexity, of course, in telecommunication systems. And Dennis de Boer said that a top-down system is simple, because a top-down system, a hierarchical system, a hierarchy is a pure symmetry. So there's no symmetry breaking. It's pure classification. At every level, we have another subclassification. So hierarchy of classification. It's a simple system. De Boer said complexity is proportional to the number of distinct tops in a top-down system. So it's not that there's one top. There's a testing top. There's a performance review top. There's a personnel development, there's a product delivery top. All of these are hierarchies within which you as a developer live and work. And these hierarchies interact with each other in very, very complex ways. And you need that in order to address the needs of complex development. So this notion of hubs, I mean, this isn't something I invented. We've had this in Scrum forever and ever. A really good example is Scrum of Scrums. And I mean, actually, this is something that Cesario and I have talked a lot about. So if you go way back to the very beginning in Scrum and look at Scrum of Scrums, what the Scrum of Scrums was after the daily Scrum, all the Scrum Masters from all the teams would get together and they would work impediments across teams. Well, that didn't work because the Scrum Masters were Scrum Masters and they really didn't understand the technical issues and they really couldn't work the impediments. So we changed that about 15 years ago to say every team should send one representative to the Scrum of Scrums. And it's usually the person who knows the most about the impediment. And that was better, but now you have a Scrum of Scrums with 15 people. 3 of them are interested in being there, and the other 12 are like, I'm wasting my time. I don't have an interest in this issue. So then, briefly, in kind of the Scrum Alliance world, the Scrum of Scrums and the Jeff Sutherland world, the Scrum of Scrums became these dynamic things that were self-forming, where teams would self-organize to coordinate with each other and form these new little organizations that would be loci of coordination. They are not loci of command and control. They're loci of coordination across teams. And that is still, as I understand it, the Scrum.org view. Everyone I've talked to in Scrum.org still talks about Scrum of Scrums that way. But now there's a problem to be solved. So, I mean, as long as the cat's out of the bag here, I mean, why does Scrum at Scale have a hierarchy of Scrum of Scrums? And each one has a Scrum Master, right? And I think there's a product owner or some kind of manager at each level. Why? Because if you're a consultant or a Scrum salesman, you don't want to go into an organization and say what I say. When I go into our organization, I say, you know, you're going to have to fire all the development managers, like Wayne Rossing did at Google in January of 2001. He fired all the project managers and all the product managers because it was stifling self-organization. Now they kind of brought back Scrum Masters and called them managers. They overreacted, but the point is, you don't want this hierarchy of managers. Why do you want a hierarchy of managers? Because if you're going out to sell Scrum and you say, fire all the managers, well, it's the managers who are paying you to come in as a consultant. And if they pay you to come in and you say, we're going to fire you all, it's not a very good business case. So this is the whole business case of SAFe and of Scrum at Scale. It's a perfect setup to find a home for all those managers so you don't have to fire them and so they don't have to go back to being developers and do what is beneath them to actually write code. It's really sickening.
Yeah. And I also remember, James, in the conversation we had over that article when I was via mail, I also said that I certainly regret how the Scrum Guide these days is presented as, yeah, this is Scrum for one team only. Because I always felt like it just describes Scrum. End of discussion. It describes how a system of Scrum, an ecosystem, whatever, should look like. And I'm sort of regretting that it's now being presented, yeah, this is Scrum for one team. No, this is, for me, it describes Scrum. It describes the behaviors. It describes some practices. It's a framework. It's not just for one team. I think.
There's some other really interesting history with respect to that. So when we first started writing the book, we were talking about, should we write scaling patterns? Because even 10 years ago, scaling was just starting to come onto the horizon as something will be a valid business thing, right? And we were talking about scaling patterns. And I said, well, patterns are about scale-free systems. And Jeff Sutherland came out very firmly and said, there is no such thing as a scaling pattern. He says, Scrum is fractal in nature. So the structure you have inside the Scrum team is the same structure you have at the next level. There is no such thing as a scaling pattern. Scrum is self-similar. And he's almost right. Fractals aren't quite the right metaphor. And this is very, very technical, very mathematical. I won't go into that.
Oh, please.
And then he comes up with Scrum at Scale. Hello? With all this hierarchy? And Avi's saying we're not going to have patterns, we're not going to have hubs. And there being nothing in the Scrum at Scale guide about anything but management control through the hierarchy. There's nothing agile about Scrum at Scale or SAFe.
Yeah.
Now,
funny that you bring up
funny
that you bring up the idea of fractal, because it was something that struck me when diving into the history of Scrum this week, the past week. So reading that paper from 1999, Scrum, an extension pattern language for hyper-productive software development. Have a look what the picture is there.
Yep.
So in 1999, Scrum patents a picture of a sort of small fractal system. It's amazing. One of the other things why I liked that article, James, it resonated with me for two reasons. I remember, so from, I don't know if everybody knows, from 2013 until 2016, I worked with Ken at Scrum.org. So with
Right.
exams and the assessments and the courseware and taking over a lot of the duties of Ken in interviewing trainers and training trainers and so traveling the world. So 3 years. And I remember by that time, that's so about 7 years ago, I remember a couple of people asking, I was in Seattle, hey Gunther, how do you see the future of Agile? Like, okay, I'm a slow thinker. I always need time, so I needed at least a couple of seconds. And I said, well, you know what, whatever Agile is, how you define, but at least the future of Agile will be in the small. So, and that's what resonated with you. That thinking big it's a bit of a problem. And then it took me several years to sort of elaborate on what I mean with the fact that the future of Agile is in the small. And that the second thing that struck me in your article, James, is the use of the term hub. Because over the years I started describing sort of a future organizational structure as something networked with hubs. And then the idea that you should use Scrum to grow a product hub. So a hub focused on a product, where a product might also be a service, doesn't have to be a traditional product. Organize around that. A hub can grow, it can shrink depending on needs and markets and opportunities and so on. Within an organization, you can establish a new hub for a new idea. Hubs are connected via structures like you describe and so on. So I call it a product hub. And a product hub in itself is also an ecosystem, meaning it's not a hierarchical structure.
Yep.
It's an ecosystem within which you have actors, you have rules, roles, self-organization, standards, agreements, and so on. But you can't point at things in a way. It's a self-organizing thing. It's an ecosystem. It adapts to external changes. It adapts to new insights within the system. And then if you have a product hub and a connection of other product hubs, the challenges of whatever we would call a transformation for me is to step by step move from a traditional hierarchical organization to a hub-based networked structure. So two things, small versus big, what you agree, and the idea of hubs.
There's another
Really
little
cool.
story I'd like to tell about that, which is, one of the reasons you come to things like this is to find the author's background. So where this all started, I was looking at scaling frameworks and thinking, all right, well, this is a problem that probably should be addressed. And I mean, SAFe was pretty easy to dismiss out of hand, in spite of the fact that they use my architecture stuff and they use it wrong. And Les, I mean, Cesario and I would fight about it all the time. I'm really starting to be intrigued by Les these days. But I had a look at Scrum at Scale. I thought, okay, Jeff's a pretty sharp guy. And then I got to looking at it, and I saw this hierarchy, right? And I thought, wait a minute. So I wrote mail to Jeff, and I said, Jeff, you say this is a scale-free system. What do you mean by scale-free system? And he responded in mail saying, well, what I mean by scale-free system is that you be able to add new teams without detracting from the per team output on the average of the whole thing. And I said, well, that's kind of interesting. So I did some real research. So I looked at UK industrial production numbers for industries across the UK, and what the essentially the contribution to GDP was of the company as a function of the number of employees. And you know what? The bigger the company, the higher the contribution per GDP. So Jeff was solving a problem that doesn't exist. I mean, already we know that adding teams will add to the per person productivity. And I told him this. He said, I've never seen that on a software team. And then, I tried to carry on the conversation. And then I started digging into what scale-free means, and I, got into some math books, and I mean, it's very nicely described in this very simple Wikipedia article. Jeff Sutherland simply does not understand what scale-free means. And There's a whole framework that came out of that misunderstanding. And there's a whole training program that came out of that misunderstanding. And a whole company, which no longer exists, and a huge lawsuit, which I trust many of you know about, which will go to trial in June of next year. And this is millions and millions and millions of dollars lawsuit. This is not an itty bitty lawsuit. So I spend, I think there's two things that drive me as an author. I mean, one is fighting ignorance, because it's just, and people do their best. It's not because they're stupid. It's just that people are raised in where they were raised, and they believe what they believe. And we need dialectic and careful, thoughtful analysis and discussion to understand how things really work. Because people come up with these stereotypes based on their upbringing and how things work, and it just doesn't work that way. And so, I mean, the other thing that drives me is having influence. I want to have influence to open people's eyes. I mean, I can't make anyone do things, but I guess one of the reasons I'm provocative, it's a way into people's minds and in a way to people's hearts. If you just try to have a measured, intellectual conversation, they'll sleep right through it, even though they're having the conversation with you. So I'm trying to twist people's heads around to be able to see things much more clearly. Now, there's also, and I'm very, very careful about, thinking through these things and discussing through these things before I come out with something. But on the other hand, I mean, I'm wrong now and then too. And so I view this and efforts like this book as keystones in the ongoing industry dialectic. And this should be, so, I mean, Scrum is interesting in that I don't know the process for the dialectic of evolving Scrum. I do know the process for the dialectic of evolving the CMMI. There is a process for evolving the CMMI. There's a process for evolving Prince 2. There's not a process for evolving Scrum. How agile is that? So we're living in this command and control world where people are telling you, this is how the world is, and you're all swallowing it and saying, oh yeah, well, this is Scrum, it must be, let's look it up in the Scrum guide, I don't want to get this wrong. Oh, I used to believe in vision, that's gone now, there must not be a vision, it's now the product goal. And we believe this stuff as though it's true. Think. How many of you are paid to think? And so it's that frustration that drives me to write these things.
I recognize that. I've had people, I don't know whether anybody recognize that, certainly, in social media, that sort of toxic environment, saying you can't say servant leader anymore because the Scrum Guide has skipped that. I'm like, yeah, but it's a powerful concept. It's a beautiful thing. So I've seen it working. So let's keep doing. And it's funny that you say that, because Scrum has evolved. I just wrote a paper about it from 1900. I started with sort of the first official presentation of Scrum in 1995, at least so they say. I'm not sure. I don't find too much evidence. Might have been 96 too, which is funny. Now, not to make this sort of historical lesson, but would you agree, James? I think I would love to read, as the last 50 minutes we have, I would like to read that article by Bob Warfield. And
well, the other thing we could do is we could open it up to more questions. You're right. I mean, the Warfield article is historically interesting, but I mean, people can go off and read that on their own. I mean, Bob isn't really here to comment on it. So, I mean, maybe people are bottling up questions there and would like to articulate a question rather than writing it in the chat. What I suggest is doing that. But I mean, you're the host, you're the master of ceremonies, but
totally fine by me. Yeah, great. If anybody has a question, let us know. You can unmute yourself if you want. Don't do it all at once, but you can still put them in the chat box too. Any questions? User stories, emergence, collaboration, cross-functional teams, thinking big, scale-free networks, scale-free organizations.
Could you clarify the definition? What is the difference of a Scrum team versus a development team? Or is it, does it matter at all?
Well, in the 2017 Scrum Guide, there was still this line between the business and engineering. And so the development team were the people who actually touch the product and develop the process, develop the product, sorry. And the product owner was more on the, quote, the business side. And then there was this dance between them, and there were two more or less separate processes. Now Scrum hasn't changed, really. The Scrum Guide has changed, so they describe that thing a little bit differently. But the notion of Scrum team was and still is the product owner and the development team together. They are one team. They are one mind. They have different roles. So we do have role specialization within the Scrum team. There is a product owner who plays a different role. Their role is to set the direction of the product. And the developers largely have the role of implementing it. But we no longer talk about the development team as being a separate team. So, I mean, a lot of this is just in kind of the way you think about it. I don't know if it actually will change anything in how people carry out Scrum, but it's a difference in focus to recognize that you have this whole team that's working in the same direction, rather than this image of the product owner and developers being at war and having to negotiate some kind of peace before they can decide on a direction. So I think it's very subtle.
Okay. So additional questions. So could one organization have, say, 3 Scrum teams working on the same product?
I think so. I mean, in the past, and this goes way beyond where I want to go in this talk, but there was a question about how many development teams can there be on a Scrum team, right? Is a Scrum team the whole thing? And I think now the Scrum team is, and I still don't like the English. I really don't think that Ken and Jeff are good at English. I used to teach English composition, so I know. So there's a cardinality problem, and that every Scrum team has a product owner, but that product owner may be shared between several Scrum teams. So the Scrum team is not an encapsulated unit. And so you can be a member of multiple teams. A product owner is a member of multiple Scrum teams.
Thanks.
And there's also a question in the chat, James, about that from Richard Lissimore, saying in your Scrum Patterns book, it says you talk about the product owners team in your patterns book, and he's wondering, doesn't that contradict what the Scrum Guide states?
Absolutely not. Again, read the pattern carefully. There is still the single wrenchable neck. There is still a single person called the product owner, who is a person who stably fills that position, who is the go-to person for the product. The product owner team works with the product owner to build prototypes, to do competitive analysis, to do whatever needs to be done, because product owner is a big job. But the accountability and the control of the product are in one person, not the committee. Now, this is thinking from a perspective of outcomes rather than outputs. And what I provocatively tell in my CSM classes is that I want 5 people on that product owner team for every person who's a developer. that's where the power is. The power is in getting great specs. The power is not in doing a lot of testing. That's the least cost-effective way we know of doing things. So I want the product owner team to really, really build great enabling specifications. Of course, these are under the direction and final approval of the product owner, who is still the point person and the final authority on the content of the product backlog. It's just that it takes a lot of people to support her.
Is the language used
to
describe the product owner in the Scrum Guide? Is it, in your view, overly simplistic or not at all? Is it just?
I think it's perfect. I think it's perfect from the point of view of responsibility, authority, control, and accountability. And those are the important things you want to get right. The rest of this about a product owner team doesn't affect any of those. It does not affect, it enhances the authority a little bit, because you're going to have people who are authority on other areas that the product owner may not be an authority on, to kind of complement the product owner's authority. But from the point of view of responsibility and control, product owner team doesn't really change any of the language of the Scrum Guide with respect to what it says. And that's what the Scrum Guide is about. It's not so much about this authority in the vernacular English sense, but about responsibility and control.
Yeah. Cool. And
accountability.
And now that I'm totally into historical things anyhow, let me share a couple of observations from my research in the paper. So in the original 1995 paper, which is actually 1996, by the way, but it's called Scrum Software Development Process with Scrum in capitals. Maybe because people, like you say, James, are not sensitive enough to language, might already have played a role by then. It was said that in Scrum, you had two sort of parts of a project team. You had management and you had development teams. That's how it's described in that paper. But it's fascinating to read in the paper that it says that the management part of the project team, so management development team, that the management part should be led by what they called in general a product manager. It's not called a product owner, but already by then, it was not an official role. And again, in the 1999 paper, so the Scrum Patterns thing, so it describes a team as having a Scrum Master, introduction of the idea of a Scrum Master plus a Scrum team. And it doesn't describe anything like a project manager or product owner role just yet, but it does say that one person, 1999, one person should make decisions over the priorities of the backlog. It was still in general called backlog, not product or sprint backlog. Yeah, one person, and in that paper also they said it should be a person known as product manager or maybe even product marketing manager. But again, he hinted at that. And it was in the first book by Ken Schwaber and Mike Beadle, so the late Mike Beadle, in 2002, Agile Software Development with Scrum, where it was officially turned into an official role within Scrum. But even in the years before that, there was at least hints on whatever of this idea of a person making decisions over priorities, and that shouldn't be as, let's say, not an IT person. So it's been there as from the early days.
Yeah, and I mean, from a cultural point of view, being anthropologists, we can distinguish between person, job, and role. All three are different. And so I don't think anything changed from 1999 to 2002. They just crisped up the language a little bit and found this role that could be the locus of all these normalized behaviors. But I don't think anything changed in the way that teams actually ran between 1999 and 2002. They found better language to describe it. It's this notion of having a single person who's responsible. Yep. And in 1989, they didn't have a name for that yet. And in 2002, they did.
Cool. Okay. Now, somebody asked about, and you responded to that, James, already about the patterns of developers control the process and so on. It's fascinating that some of those patterns are already referenced in 1999. There's also, by the way, a pattern being referred to by them called the self-selective process, the self-selective teams. You remember that? It's a long time ago that you described that. But...
Oh, self-selecting team, self-managing team. And again, this comes out of empirical research. 10 years of empirical research out of Bell Labs looking at what makes teams effective. Now, what I think most people don't understand, and I just gave a keynote on this at the Scrum gathering, both in Brazil and in Mexico, is that if you look at where Scrum is today and where Agile is today, most of it came out of the pattern discipline. So if you look at most of the early folks in Agile, with the exception of Ken and Jeff, they were the odd folks out. All these people came from the pattern movement. And if you look at the principles of patterns in terms of emergence and self-organization and iterations and local changes, all these things were pattern ideas. So I think the two big reasons that Agile came to realization were that it was the advent of new technology, faster processors that allowed people to work individually and have enough processing power locally so they didn't have to go to the comm center. And that enabled very rapid turnaround. Plus this realization that Alexander gave to the industry about complex systems. And these things kind of welled up together and met in. And I really think the patterns had a bigger influence on Jeff. I don't know about Ken, but in talking to Jeff, I'm pretty sure that he was very plugged into these, and these had a big influence on a lot of the early ideas in Scrum. So yeah, I mean, and of course, you talk to other people who are not of, well, I guess he is of our generation, but Richard Gabriel. And so he's a Lisp guy, and he says, well, I mean, the MIT people at the Lisp programmers were doing all the same stuff in the 1950s. And so there's really nothing new here. But it's just these ignorance and cultural factors that keep helping us forget. And I think this penchant of, or this factor of human nature, where human nature really wants control and wants individual autonomy rather than giving way to a team. And so history of software development has been this constant tension and this constant battle. And I mean, my fear, I mean, I have the same sense that you do, Gunther, and looking at the same Scrum guide, it's a little more heavyweight. And I know they wave their hands and say, you know, by commit, we really don't mean commit. We just use the word. Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain, right? And it's moving back, I fear, toward this more command and control world. And my guess is that's market driven, is that maybe Ken and Jeff have seen this from their constituency, that people are saying, well, we aren't going to use Scrum because we need this management control. And they're saying, all right, well, we'll adjust the Scrum guide to make things a little easier for you. And maybe that's just my own fantasy. But yeah, my fear is that we're seeing another swing that's going to swing back away from Agile. That's compounded by the Agile backlash. In fact, we have very few data that Agile has done well. One final thought on this. Again, when I teach Scrum, I say, okay, we're going to teach Agile, and I spend 2 hours and I teach them Agile. And I say, now forget all that. Now we're going to learn Scrum. Scrum is a very shallow, superficial set of 4 stupid principles. Scrum is 100 times bigger and has to do with efficiency, not with self-organization. And yeah, Agile is okay, and it is important, but it is not the core of Scrum. The core of Scrum comes from the Toyota production system and its notions of designing for efficiency. There's a whole nother layer here, and I see this as next work. I see Kira Harada is on the chat here, and Kira Harada-san is my sensei. So he's the one who today has taught me everything I know. And from him and some books I've reading recently, I'm beginning to believe that not only the Agile community, but the Scrum community got it wrong from TPS. And if you look at what Taiichi Ono really said about what flow is, I mean, Kanban is a good example. I haven't met a single person in Agile who understands Kanban properly, based on my understanding from reading these books and talking to Kiro-san. You look at flow, you look at swarming, all these ideas that we hold dear, and there's tremendous confusion about them. And I finally have come to understand exactly what Taiichi Ono is really about and what really makes Toyota successful. And Scrum isn't there. Scrum doesn't get it. Kiro-san, we need to talk about this. I'm very excited about this. It's really fascinating.
Great. It sort of connects a little bit, and maybe can use that as a closing. So by the end of that historical paper that I wrote, I shared a short personal musing about what I called title Scrum and the Desire for Universal Truth. So everybody's looking for exact precision, universal truths in that simple document. And what you just was just a living example of my closing sentence of that, and allow me just to read that one sentence. It requires ability and courage to understand and build on the language and words provided by the Scrum Guide, and focus on their intent and purpose.
Yeah.
So look beyond just a literal interpretation of the words and the exactness and exclamation points and commas and hyphens, whatever. Look beyond that. Look to intent and purpose and try to get that across. And that's what you just did, James. So thank you.
Now, if I could have two closing comments. One is, in that same spirit, I've learned a lot about the Buddhist influence on Scrum. And I mean, and Jeff Sutherland is in many ways every inch a Buddhist. He's a Buddhist monk. He really is. And Buddhism is about finding your true self. And I don't think you're going to find your true self in something outside of yourself. There's a saying in Buddhism that if someone says, you know, I am the Buddha and I have truth, kill him. Kill the Buddha. Because if something outside of you says they are the Buddha, it can't be the Buddha. The Buddha is in you. When you read the Scrum Guide, follow your heart. This is about following your instinct. Scrum is just training wheels to awaken your instinct of all those things that society has destroyed in you. And it's training wheels. At the end of that, now you can leave the Scrum Guide behind and really rock. The second thing I want to say, I mean, I like what you started this, where you said about our initial introduction. You said, okay, I'm not going to ask for any NDAs. I'm not going to ask to get paid. I love doing these events and giving to the community. So, you know, we gave this free event to the community. If you felt this was worthwhile, this good free event, take €100 and contribute it to your favorite charity this holiday season in memory of this event of being, maybe having learned a few things and inspiring a few things, and do some good in the world, and just take €100, give it to your favorite charity as a way of feeling that you've given something back for what we've given you in this event. I think that'd really be sweet, and let us know about it.
And that's the most beautiful closing possible of this session. I want to thank everybody, certainly James, but certainly everybody to be here. I always say that, you know what, maybe James and I are presenting and talking a lot, but it wouldn't make much sense if there was nobody to listen to and listen to us and interact with. So we're all part of this together. It's not about James, it's not about me, it's about us and what we can do to make this world a little bit of a better place to live and to work in. Sort of what I try to do with how I see Scrum. It's also why I call using Scrum to humanize the workplace. Make it sort of more about people again. So thank you very much for being here. There was a lot of people on the waiting list, so maybe we should do another session. But you know what?
I'd love to.
I'm really up for a break now for at least a couple of weeks, or maybe something for, who knows, maybe January or so, who knows?
Yeah,
Okay.
That'd be fine. Thank you for your leadership in setting this up, and of course, for the wonderful book. We all have you to thank for pulling that together. Thank you, everyone, for all your contributions to the community, for all you've given. And I mean, we learn from you. That's how we come up with these things. We don't sit in the ivory towers and make them up. So happy holidays to everyone. All my good friends out there. Ivalo, I see you. Dimitrios, I see you. A lot of old friends, everyone else. Thanks for showing up. Keep in touch. Have a great holiday.
Okay, great. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.